Morning, Dr. Welcher.
Good morning. We haven't been formally introduced. Your whole name?
Robert Alessi, sir.
Robert Alessi. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Dr. Welcher, the area in which you engage can also include, and I believe you used the term on direct, forensics, correct? Do you engage in any forensic activity in your profession?
Yes, the general umbrella of you basically coming in and giving scientific evidence in court applies to forensics. So my main job is action reconstruction and biomechanics, and so that's what I do. Sometimes it doesn't involve court. When it goes to court, that's generally forensics.
Right. So you're here today, that is my question, you're here today at least in part with regard to forensics, correct? Because forensics is the Latin term for it is basically you're going to have some type of court or jury presentation. It's for law, correct? Would you agree with that? It's for law, forensics?
I mean, exactly the way you asked that, no. It's for engineering and it's for biomechanics. It's in the court of law, I think is what you're asking.
That's exactly it.
Okay, yes, certainly for the court of law, yes.
It ends up to a court of law, and in forensics is a common term.
Yes, sir.
So it relates to, or it's used in, or it's suitable for a court of law, the analysis. You'd agree with that? It's a general principle?
Yes.
Not a trick question. Okay. And so in forensics, what you're doing, among other things, is you're applying the scientific method and principles in here in a criminal matter, correct?
Yeah, you try and apply as much as possible.
Right. And so the primary goal of forensic science is to uncover the truth and to provide objective evidence that can be presented in court.
That is generally correct. Again, there are elements, for example, this analysis that are relying sort of on subjective evidence, like the testimonial, the witness statements. So it's not solely based, but ideally you'd want it as much as possible based on objective data.
So you would agree that truth and objective evidence is part of the presentation in terms of information for forensics in a court of law?
Certainly objective information. Truth sometimes, again, can be subjective.
Oh, so you don't believe truth? You believe sometimes truth applies and sometimes it doesn't?
If you know for a fact it is true, but if you take someone's deposition testimony, you have to look at it relative to the evidence, and it's either consistent with the evidence or not.
Okay, so now let's go to your direct examination that you just went through.
Please.
Hopefully this is fairly straightforward. You have testified to, and it's varied a bit, a reasonable degree of engineering certainty. Is that correct?
Correct.
You've also, have you used the word sometimes to reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
I may have.
Right. So
I don't know.
in terms of your role as a biomechanical engineer and accident reconstructionist, is it important to engage in a critical analysis of the data?
Critical analysis? Yeah, I think it's important to have a critical analysis. You want to try and look at it from all sides, consider all possibilities.
So it is therefore important to try to review the data as objectively as possible. You had mentioned sometimes subjectivity comes in, but I understand the goal is to try to look at it as objectively as possible, correct?
Correct.
Now, you stated with respect to your conclusions early on in your direct testimony and your analysis that you don't, and I think I've got it quoted, you don't have a dog in the fight. Is that what you said, sir?
I did.
And that you, quote, don't care, end quote, about the outcome. That's what you made a point of saying in the beginning,
That
correct?
is 100% correct.
Now, you simply follow the data. Is that correct?
I try to do that.
You try to do that.
I'm not perfect. So
Okay.
I do my best. I believe I've done it here.
Okay. So, in terms of you've agreed that you apply the scientific method, so I want to see if you're in agreement generally so the jury can understand what the scientific method is. Are you familiar with NIST? National Institute?
Yes.
Yeah. So would you agree with this definition of the scientific method? The systematic pursuit of knowledge involving the recognition and definition of a problem, the collection of data through observation and experimentation, analysis of the data, the formulation, evaluation, and testing of hypotheses, and where possible, the selection of a final hypothesis. Is that a general fair statement of the scientific method?
So for forensics, you'd have to add in the testimonial evidence aspect of it. So those are testimonial, or things are in evidence. So frequently there's one or two versions, and you're trying to match which version is most consistent with the evidence.
Okay, adding that to what I stated relative to NIST, you would agree that evaluation and testing of hypotheses, and where possible, the selection of a final hypothesis, is the scientific method, correct?
Generally, yes.
Is it correct that a proper biomechanical injury analysis utilizes a sound scientific methodology that's been subjected to peer-reviewed and a publication that's been generally accepted in the engineering community?
Well, I can't. So this, I've done my analysis here, biomechanical analysis. I can't submit this analysis to peer review. I'm not allowed to give this to people outside the court. So there would be no way for me to submit my analysis for peer review. So this occurs forensics all the time. The forensic analysis in court generally never goes under a peer review process. The methodologies underneath it, and looking at, like, for example, I think I referenced 25 papers in my report. That goes to the issue of trying to follow the science. 26.
So I think you may have misunderstood my question, sir. I was talking about your methodology, your biomechanical injury methodology. The methodology that you use and apply is to be subject to peer review and general acceptance in the engineering community. Is that correct?
So I have no way of publishing this analysis.
I'm sorry, sir, to interrupt you.
I need to.
Go ahead and answer your question.
You're asked peer reviewed, like you said, means I give it to my peers. I send it out to somebody to review for the scientific method. That's what the peer review process is. So I will gladly send this out to peer review with the court's permission, but I haven't and cannot do that.
Sir, my question is not your analysis here in this case.
Oh.
My question regards the methodology that you use here. Is the methodology, you said 26 references, right? My question is simply, is the methodology that you used for your analysis in this matter, is the methodology for a proper biomechanical analysis, should that methodology be generally accepted in the engineering community?
I think with the forensic application, yes.
Okay, that was my question, just the methodology. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, the scientific method that you've used in this case, part of the use of scientific method, the purpose is to avoid what is called bias in the scientific method, right? Not cultural bias, but just bias in terms of the application of methodologies and principles. You would agree that's a pretty fundamental purpose of the scientific method, is to avoid biases?
The purpose of the scientific method is to get the most logical and correct answer without bias.
Exactly. To do it apply the scientific method without bias being part of the application of the method, correct?
That's hopefully what you can do.
That's hopefully what you can do. That is the goal, right?
That is one of many goals, yes.
So Are you familiar with the term confirmation bias?
I am.
And that relates, confirmation bias is part of a larger term. Are you familiar with cognitive bias?
Generally, I'm not a human factors expert, though.
Pardon me?
I'm not a human factors expert.
All right, this is, biases are, don't you agree that cognitive biases are not just for one category? You would agree it applies to medical analyses, it applies to doctors doing studies, engineers doing studies, and other scientists doing studies?
I'm not a cognitive expert. I think I would generally agree with it, but I don't want to step out of my lane. I'm not an expert on cognitive. I can talk to you about confirmational bias, if you like.
Let's talk about confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias is actually when someone selectively gathers and interprets evidence to confirm one or another's beliefs, as well as neglecting evidence that contradicts those beliefs. Is that a fair statement of confirmation bias?
That is a statement. Yeah, it could be broader, but sure.
But you would agree that that is generally correct, what
Generally,
confirmation bias is. And an example of confirmation bias is not considering alternative hypotheses once an initial hypothesis has been selected, even though data and information might contradict the initial hypothesis. Is that an example of confirmation bias?
That could be, yes.
And confirmation bias is antithetical. It's against the scientific method. It's to be avoided, correct?
You would like to avoid it, yes.
Are you familiar with the term failure analysis?
Generally, you might need to define how you're using it for me.
Sure. So is failure analysis the enablement of a scientific examination of an alleged incident by beginning at the undesired consequences? Is that a fair use of that phrase?
I was thinking something different, like a piece of metal failing. I guess it could fall into that category.
Okay. And would you agree that the first question, or one of the first questions that are to be asked by a biomechanical engineer when conducting an analysis of, say, an injury, is how did this happen? Is that one of the first few questions that you ask?
No, that's usually the last question.
Oh, so for you...
So hold on a second.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Generally, what you want to do is gather data. You want to know what injuries there are, what evidence there is, like, for example, on the vehicles. And then the very last thing you want to know or define is, given all that information, how did it happen? So that's the end.
I think you may have misunderstood my question, sir. I wasn't talking about the method or the process. I was talking about when you get to answering questions, whenever that is in the process. Isn't one of the questions, and maybe one of the first questions, how did this happen?
No, that's not one of the first questions. One of the first questions is, where's the damage? What are the injuries? What's the evidence? What black box or tech stream data do we have? What physical evidence was at the scene? So that is certainly not one. It is a question, but that question is at or near the end.
Isn't every one of the questions that you just mentioned part of the data gathering?
Correct, but,
Okay.
but when you're gathering data, you're always asking yourself questions along the way, like, what is this? Where did it come from?
But you would agree that for you at least some point, it's how did this happen, correct?
Yes.
And don't you ask that question to come up with hypotheses?
I generally have many working hypotheses as I'm working on the case, and then as the evidence comes in, I'm applying that to my hypotheses and either accepting or rejecting the hypotheses based upon the factual information.
Sir, how then is it just a matter of logic or a syllogism? If you don't ask the question, how did this happen, until the end, how do you then not get your hypotheses up front when, under the scientific method, you should be having different hypotheses up front? How is it that you ask the how did it happen at the end and not go through hypotheses in the beginning? Can you help me with that logic?
Sure, I guess I misunderstood. Like I was trying to give you an answer to how it happened. So when you're answering how it happened, or you want to be able to answer that question, you want to make sure you've looked at the totality of the data, accepted, rejected, things as they came along, to be able to answer that final question, how did it happen? But along the way, like for example, a right eye laceration, you want to know how that happened, so you look for the evidence of how that may have happened.
So you would agree then that questions of how it happened, formulating and identifying hypotheses, does and can happen toward the beginning of the analysis. It doesn't happen at the end all the time. Would you agree with that?
So the ultimate question of how did it happen happens at the end. The questions about the elements of what occurred to make it happen, those occur at the beginning, middle, all along the way.
You would agree that creating hypotheses occurs more toward the beginning than toward the end of the analysis. Is that correct?
There are probably more hypotheses in the beginning, but I am continually forming, looking at hypotheses, either accepting or rejecting them upon the evidence.
So you would agree that the creation of hypotheses does occur more toward the beginning of the analysis. You would agree with that?
There are more towards the beginning. The process occurs throughout the whole investigation.
Right. I'm asking about the hypotheses, sir. You would agree that the hypotheses occur more toward the beginning than the end, just the hypotheses.
So I don't know if you and I are saying different things. More hypotheses in the beginning because you have more questions in the beginning. You continue to form hypotheses as the data presents itself, so you don't stop the formation of hypotheses. It's just as you get more evidence, you window down the number of questions.
Maybe I can, just this last question, make it clearer for you, sir. You would agree, not analysis, which you added, as I heard it to the last part, just hypotheses. Mm-hmm. You would agree that even though hypotheses can be created and changed perhaps all the way up to the end, mm-hmm. you would agree that it's important in the analysis to create at least some hypotheses, plural, in the beginning, correct?
Yes.